Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It's the 26th of May and we had Build this week. So there's a lot of updates this week. I'm not covering everything they did at Build. That would be impossible. I would check out the Build book of news to see all of the key announcements they made, and there's links to different blog articles, the detail. I've got that in the link, the description, the video below. There were lots of AI announcements, obviously, things about bringing Copilot to Windows, in addition to Copilot's already been announced to Microsoft 365 and the security services. I'm really hoping we see a Clippy interface for the Windows Copilot. There was a new Azure AI content safety service. So this is really powerful in that it will look at text, information, images, and highlight negative, harmful content. There was the new Microsoft Fabric service for data analytics, which is going to include a Copilot service. There were the new Azure deployment environments, which really make it easy for developers to quickly just deploy a set of infrastructure based around some scenario as an ARM template or Terraform, and a whole bunch of other things. Again, check out the book of news. So I have got chapters, but they're fairly broad this week because there's just so many announcements. But you can jump to a particular one and see the set of updates you care about the most. I did do one new video this week, but it was just one because obviously preparing this is my hobby. I do it in the spare time. The build stuff takes up a lot of time. So I did a video all about Winget, really powerful way to have package management for my Windows clients. So I went into detail on that. Okay, so what's new? So on the computer side, a number of things around containers. Now, I talked about this last week. I'm only bringing it up again because they did kind of announce it at Build. This was the Azure Container Storage Service. The whole idea here is I have some stateful set of containers. Instead of me having to manage the backend Azure disks or Azure file shares or Azure NetApp files, what this service does is it provides a managed solution. It's backed by the Azure Elastic SAN, it's backed by Azure disks or the ephemeral disks in the host themselves, but it's going to just provide this managed pool available. It's going to connect from the pods, the nodes, using the NVMe over Fabric, i.e. RDMA, or if it's the Azure Elastic SAN, it will use iSCSI, which is the protocol that supports. So it's really going to be useful for those stateful workloads that need some kind of persistent volume storage. It is Linux-based nodes today that are being supported. Then for the AKS, there's a number of announcements around Azure Kubernetes service. The first is we have a container host operating system, Ubuntu, for example, and then we have the CBL Mariner, which is the Microsoft Linux distribution. And now for that container host specific purpose, it's now called Azure Linux. So that Azure Linux is optimized to be a container host operating system. It only has the components it needs for the container host purpose. So it's got a smaller attack surface. So now AKS, I still have the choice. I have Ubuntu. I can use now the Azure Linux, formerly known as Mariner. And also, they've announced that it will be available for the AKS on Azure Stack HCI and Windows Server. We'll be able to use that same container host OS as well. Also for AKS, Gen 2 VM support for Windows. So Generation 2 virtual machines shift from what was BIOS-based to UEFI-based. That UEFI gives us things like a virtual TPM, but also there's enhanced types of storage support, sizes, memory support, a whole bunch of other features that I can now take advantage of with my Windows-based node pools. There's now a Kubernetes marketplace. So if I think about, hey, I'm running my AKS and I want to first-party and third-party additions to that, well, there's a Kubernetes marketplace. I can access this in one of two ways. If I'm looking at my AKS cluster, then I can just go and look at the extensions and applications portion of the navigation, and I can add an application there from the marketplace, or I can just go straight from the marketplace and look at the containers category. So I'm going to be able to leverage that. Also for my Windows node pools, Linux has had this for a while, I can now have custom node configurations in preview. Now this is limited for Windows, it's only about kubelet configuration, whereas with Linux I can also do some stuff on the OS. But I can create a kubelet configuration file, which I then specify as part of the node pool creation. I think there's only 4 options today. The percentage of disk space used after which image garbage collection I clean up the disk space is always run. A percentage of disk space which image garbage collection should never be run, i.e. it's less than the other value. Maximum size of a container log file before it's rotated. And then the maximum number of container log files that can be present for a container. But it enables me to modify that default behavior related to the kubelet for my nodes in a Windows node pool. Kubernetes Fleet Management can now manage multi-clusters. So this is all about the idea that, hey, I've got a number of clusters. I want to have a consistent management experience, a consistent environment across those clusters. I can now group my clusters maybe into environments. Hey, I've got my dev set of clusters, my user acceptance testing, my production. And now when I roll out a change, I can roll it out in a specific order based on those groupings. I can have a time delay between them to give me time to check and do validation. But the fleet management will now handle all of that. On the Azure Container Apps, remember Azure Container Apps is built on AKS, but it abstracts that away. But it layers on top things like Dapper, which makes it really easy for me to create microservices as a whole bunch of features that I can easily access via a sidecar. CADA for better scaling, so network services so I can split portions of traffic, etc. But now we have jobs. So the idea of a job is that it's some task that I need to fire off, and then once it finishes, it disappears. It's any containerized task that fits that behavior. It could be, hey, a task to do some data migration, a task to do some kind of batch processing, some on-demand processing I need, but it's not running continuously. If it's running continually, well, that's just a regular Azure Container App. And I can schedule this to run either manually, so on demand, I can schedule it using a cron expression. We all love cron expressions, or it can be event-driven. A message is written to a certain queue. And it's going to use my existing Azure Container Apps environment to run these jobs, the consumption or the dedicated plans. Also for Azure Container Apps, we now have managed TLS certificates. We're seeing this more and more on many services that support custom domains. So rather than I have to go and buy a certificate for that custom domain for the service and import it in, once I've validated I do own that domain by normally, maybe it's a redirection record to the Azure Container App's name, it will now go and create the TLS certificate for me. It's signed by the Microsoft trust chain, which rolls up to a root certificate authority. And hey, it's just going to now handle those certificates for me. And now also we have secrets as volume mounts. So there's different ways I can have secrets. I can have them as, for example, via environment variables. They could be in a key vault. But instead of now exposing it via an environment variable, what I can do is expose it via a volume mount. So I'll see a /mnt/secrets, and then each secret would be a file. The file name would be the name of the secret. The content would be the value of the secret. So it makes it very easy to interact with those and leverage them from the applications running inside those Azure Container Apps. Continuing on with compute, more than one slide today. Azure Functions, SQL bindings, the enhancer has now gone GA. So it just makes it more easy to integrate with Azure SQL Database from an Azure function, both from input-output bindings, but also I can think about the ability to trigger an Azure function on some data change in an Azure SQL database. Azure Functions also now have the V2 Python model has gone GA. This is going to be more familiar for Python developers. If I think about those triggers and bindings, they're now declared as decorators. I have a simplified folder structure, and it's just got more accessible documentation for me. I also now have Azure Functions for microservices. So if I think about Azure Functions has a set of, well, it's a host, it's a runtime, it's got extensions. Well, now I can take those things and deploy it as a container through the portal, through the Azure CLI, through DevOps, to my Azure Container Apps environment. So I can run those familiar functions I've created with the models I'm used to, the triggers I'm used to, the bindings I'm used to. There is a limited set, but I can just run that Azure function in my Azure Container Apps environment. So this gives me a lot more flexibility in how I can use those. Azure Static Web Apps linked APIs has gone GA. Remember, static web apps are great for pre-rendered content. There's no server-side computing. It's serving me up my HTML, my style sheets, my JavaScript in the files, whatever that is, but there's no compute side. If I needed some compute side, server-side processing, then it has these idea of managed functions. As part of my code, it can compile and deploy the Azure function, and it will link it as a relative path through this /API and then the name of the function just as part of it, so I can easily interact. But I can also bring my own. So what linked APIs do is I can configure my own resource in my static web app that could be a backend API hosted on, yes, an Azure function, but it could be an Azure App Service, it could be an Azure Container App, it could be Azure API Management, and it will get that same relative path, the /API/ the name of however I'm exposing it, that when I use that relative path, it will automatically seamlessly route it to whatever is backing that. So that ability has now gone GA. For Container Insights, which remember, Container Insights is all about bringing me those key metrics, those key logs, those key recommendations for container workloads, we have a new cluster optimization workbook that will be available when I go and look at Container Insights. This is in preview, but this is all going to drive optimizations around, well, grouping anomalies together to make it easy to see the key ones I have in my environment so I can go and do something about it. Liveness probe failures, the ability to highlight high or low CPU or memory utilization compared to the limits. It's going to color code these. So if my limits are way out from what's actually being used, it will flag this big red little shape to make it easy to see I should go and dive in and investigate that. AKS Draft-based automated deployments is now in preview. So Draft is this technology that can really simplify the ability to deploy both the Docker file, the Kubernetes manifest, and now if I use the AKS automated deployment, so it's just in the portal, I can go to automated deployments, I can point it to my repo, it will go and set up that automated deployment pipeline using GitHub Actions, but now it can use Draft to simplify the creation of the artifacts it needs, those Docker files, those Kubernetes manifests, and it will do that automated deployment straight from that environment. Azure Container Instances now support confidential containers. This is a new enhanced SKU, and it's basing it on the AMD SKUs. So it's the whole VM. It's not using a particular enclave, so I have to change my application. So I get that trusted execution environment. I get that encrypted memory. So my Azure Container Instances now have that degree of enhanced security and isolation, even at the hypervisor and the hardware level. So that is now GA. For my high performance compute, there are these new HBV4 and HX SKUs. The big difference here is they're both AMD EPYC 9004 series. They both support up to 176 CPU cores, but the HB is more of a, I don't know if general purpose is the right term, but a more even distribution. I can go up to 688 gigabytes of memory, whereas the HX is memory intensive, so we can go up to 1.4 terabytes of memory. And I say go up to, they have that amount of memory. It doesn't matter how many cores you have. The HBV4 has 688 gigabytes of memory. The HX has 1.4 terabytes of memory. And then there's like 400 gigabits per second of InfiniBand throughput. Just huge, staggering numbers. RHEL 9.2 is now supported in those AMD confidential virtual machines. So I can go and try out the RHEL 9.2 in those whole VM encrypted environments. The app service portal now supports auto-scaling in preview, and we talked about this in previous updates. So we're used to the idea of changing the number of instances we have. But what the auto-scale does is it bases that scaling. I set a minimum number and a maximum number still, but it's now going to auto-scale based on the number of incoming HTTP requests and the relative load on the workers. So it's going to scale in a different way, and I can now set that up from the portal. And Logic Apps has a brand new data mapping designer. So this is for my XML and my JSON-based schemas. It can do XML to XML, JSON to JSON, or any combination of XML and JSON. It includes string and data manipulation, so I can create expressions to modify it. And it's just a really nice drag and drop experience to, hey, my source schema, my target schema, how I'm mapping them, the manipulations I want. And it's all via an extension in VS Code. So it's super easy to access. On the storage side, this is an easy one. Azure Files large file shares now have geo-redundancy. So the large file shares shift me from 5 terabytes maximum to 100 terabyte maximum. They also have higher IOPS and throughput, but before I can only do LRS and ZRS. With this in preview, I can now add to that GRS and GZRS. So this is a really big deal if I'm using these larger file shares and I want that geo-replication for that additional resiliency from, hey, something happens at a regional level. On the database side, get ready. So for Cosmos DB, now has burst capacity as in GA. So normally, and this is wherever this applies, I have a certain number of request units that I either provision as just a provision mode, or it can auto scale, but it's not the serverless mode. So I have a certain number of request units. Well, if I've provisioned that certain number, but I'm using less, what we can do is start to accrue credit. And I can accrue up to 5 minutes worth of that provisioned amount. So if I was provisioned for 100 request units per second, I could accrue 100 times 5 minutes. So 100 times 300. So 30,000 request units I could accrue to then use in a burst mode of up to 3,000 request units per second. Now that's assuming that compute power is available at that moment in time, but assuming it is, what it allows me to now do is I could potentially have a slightly lower request unit amount than I need for those little peak times, because I'll burst up for those short times where I need that higher amount available. So this is the NoSQL API, the API for MongoDB, Gremlin Table, and Cassandra APIs, and I enable it at the account level. I can now set a custom time to live, so that's GA. So if I have my documents, I can set a custom time to live so I only store the documents for the time I want them. I have hierarchical partition keys in GA. Normally when I create my container, I have a partition key. That's how the data is sharded. That's how I'm going to interact and query it to give me the most optimal use of my request units. But what if I have other types of interactions where I need to use maybe a different partition key? In the past, maybe we use the change feed to copy it to a whole new container with a different partition key. Sometimes maybe we'd use some synthetic keys to try and do this. With the hierarchical partition keys, I can have up to 3 levels of partition key. Imagine I'm a multi-tenant environment. The first partition key might be tenant. The second partition key could be the user, then maybe even a session based on how I want to interact and optimize my request units. So that is now generally available. Serverless now supports up to 1 terabyte of storage. Remember, with serverless, I only pay for the request units up to a maximum I specify that I'm actually using. And that maximum possible I can set increases once I go past 250 terabytes of storage. So I'm only paying for those RUs I consume, but it now supports up to 1 terabyte of storage. I now have computed properties. So computed properties aren't persisted as items themselves. Instead, they're derived from existing properties that I have, and it's expressed just as a query. So I can reference these in my business logic queries, just like any other persisted property that I would have in the database. So it can make it maybe easier for more complex types of interactions. I can now do an in-account restore. So in scenarios where a certain container or database was deleted by mistake or maybe even maliciously, it's easier to perform that restore, just in place in the database. Materialized views are in preview. This is for the NoSQL API. Materialized views, actually similar to some of these other things, it removes, again, that need of maybe using a change feed to copy data or a synthetic key made up of different things. And it may give me another view into my data, excuse me, based on a different type partition key. So it's a simple builder that I specify, and I specify the subset of the data I need, the query used to populate that materialized view, and it will keep it in sync with that source container. I now have, if I am using the change feed, this new all versions and deletes option for the change feed. Now, normally with the change feed, it's a latest version. So when it goes to do the read, it will take the value that is there at that time. Now, if there had been some intermediary value in between the last read and this current one, it wouldn't read it. It would just take the current value. What this all versions does is if there has been an intermediate value since the last read, it will get that as well. The latest version doesn't take deletes. This will take the deletes as well. Now, there are some requirements around making certain types of backup. Continuous backup is running, but I can now specify this alternate mode for the change feed. And I also now have vector search for MongoDB. So a vector search is all about the idea of it's similar items based on the data characteristics as opposed to an exact match based on a property. So this is really useful for artificial intelligence. If I have some artificial intelligence driven application, I might have machine learning to go and create these vectors that represent text or images. And then with this vector search, I can then look for similarities between vectors across those images or that textual information as part of my outputs. So this is a really nice feature. Still on database, SQL Database Hyperscale. Remember, Hyperscale is the big capacity, high performance. It separates out the compute from the page servers. Well, now supports elastic pools. So previously, Hyperscale was, hey, I have my Hyperscale instance. It's one database. So like regular SQL now, I can have an elastic pool. It's a shared set of compute power of storage. I can have up to 25 databases in that elastic pool. So enable me to get maybe better utilization. If I have higher compute requirements at different times, I can better utilize the overall capacity available to me. And I still have the ability to scale up and down the compute separately from the actual storage, which can be up to 100 terabytes for an elastic pool. And that's just going to grow dynamically as needed. Oracle migration. Now, there's a number of different technologies they talked about here. There's the Azure Database Migration Service to actually help migrate offline and online Oracle to Postgres, to Azure SQL Database. There's a database schema conversion toolkit. I think that's preview, that will look at the various database objects in Oracle and convert them from that Oracle compliant format to a Transact SQL format. The tables, the indexes, the views, the procedures, the triggers, to just simplify and accelerate that migration. Azure SQL Managed Instance Ledger is in preview. Remember, ledgers are all about cryptographic proof that there has not been any tampering. So now I have that ledger capability in preview for Managed Instance. And Cosmos Database Workspace Data KQL transformations. So if I'm taking data and I want to take it to Log Analytics, Log Analytics charges me for the amount of data ingested. So what I can do is I can create a data collection rule, one data collection rule, but then I can have a different transformation for each table in there. And that transformation could drop a certain amount of data. It could transform to a smaller amount of data. So I can be more cost effective with what I'm actually bringing into Log Analytics. So that has gone GA. Miscellaneous. So Azure Data Explorer now has log alerts. So we're used to the idea of creating an alert from log analytics, from metric data, from app insights data. Well, now if I have Azure Data Explorer, I can create alerts based on that as well. I can even do joins on data from different sources in a single query. So it's now just going to give me more things I can alert from. If I'm sending logs and information into Azure Data Explorer, instead of, for example, log analytics, I can still now query that and have log alerts firing from that. They also support managed identities as well as part of that. So I can have the exact permissions for my log alert rules. Managed Prometheus has gone GA. Prometheus is really the de facto standard when I think about containerized workload monitoring. And what this is a fully managed version of this. Now it's still built on the regular time series Azure Monitor Metrics solution that we use for many other metrics in Azure. And what it's doing is it's adding a new ingestion endpoint that's compatible with Prometheus Remote Write and also open telemetry based data collectors. And then it adds a new query, a Prometheus compatible query endpoint, so I can run my PromQL to actually make queries against the data stored in the Azure Monitor Metrics time series database. So it's available. I can get my managed Prometheus. It's also available in preview for Arc-enabled Kubernetes, i.e. any CNCF compatible Kubernetes that I've enlightened with Arc. So there we go. Azure Key Vault role-based access control recommended. I'm not fully clear on this, honestly. I've been recommending this for years since it came out. So with Azure Key Vault, there was the old policy model where I would have a policy, I would grant a certain identity, a permission, and that permission would apply to everything of that type with those permissions in the entire Key Vault. Whereas role-based access control would let me, at a very granular level, a particular secret, a particular key, have roles. It was compatible with Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. It would follow the existing regular model of ARM. So I've been pushing that for years. Well, I guess maybe that's now the default, or they're pushing, hey, stop using the policy, use the role-based access control. Azure Reservation Utilization alerts. So reservations enable us to commit to use a certain amount of something for a period of time, and we get a discount on that. But maybe we're not fully utilizing it, we're underutilizing it, or maybe we're not utilizing it at all. So now I can configure an alert. So it will email me saying, hey, you're underutilizing your reservation. It'll have a nice link so I can go and dive in and see how I'm underutilizing it, and I can take corrective measures. Azure Backup recovery points now have soft delete in preview. So if I have a recovery point and it's been deleted, well, providing it was deleted less than 14 days ago, I can just undelete that. That's free. I don't pay for that 14 days. There is also an extended soft delete for a configurable amount of time, but then I pay for the retention past the 14 days. So this is really useful in both an accidental, maybe I changed the policy and it deleted a recovery point. I was like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I can go and bring it back. Or maybe something malicious. Someone actually went and deleted this. And then Windows 365, that cloud-based PC, now has Windows 365 boot. This enables me to take a physical Windows 11 device and it will boot directly into my Windows 365 PC. So I don't have to authenticate to my local machine. I literally start the machine up and I authenticate directly into the Windows 365 remote Windows OS. And that was it. I said there was a lot of stuff. Obviously, I went through it very quickly because there was so much. But check out the book of news if you want to dive into any particular thing. As always, I hope this was useful. Until the next video, take care.